Hey, welcome back, family. This is Andre Smith, Professor Smith, Smitty Bonton. You can call me just about anything you want, just about. All right, so today we're going to do something a little bit new. We have produced several videos on Afro-Atlantic jurisprudence, introducing my concept of Afro-Atlantic jurisprudence, talking about laws and autopoietic system, right? What would the law be if there actually was a mythical island on which only black people could breathe? What is the better system? So that's what this is all about, is trying to take the system that we know, deconstruct it, and then construct a better system, right? Deconstruction, criticism is cool, but if we're trying to move to a better place from where we are at now, then we need to take the good from the old system, recognize the bad, then come up with something different. And this is part of that. Um, and so, Afro-Atlantic jurisprudence, we've done a few different episodes, and we're going to return to that. But we're going to go into a second track here. So this will be, I guess, our second series of videos, and this one is going to be called Race and Taxes in 21st Century America, or How Starve the Beast Tax Policy Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. Right, that's going to be the title of my next book. And as a matter of fact, what we're doing right now, or what you're helping me do, is prepare it. All the chapters are pretty much done, but I want to present it to you all first and make sure it's, again, as I've mentioned before, we want to make sure all of what we're doing is theoretically and philosophically consistent from top to bottom. At the same time, we also want you to be interested in it. So we're going to use these videos, I guess about six. Right, this will be the first of about six videos on race and taxes in 21st century America, how Starve the Beast tax policy created the Black Lives Matter movement. Right, this will be my second book. We already did, or at least I already wrote, Black Tax, Tax Law and Racial Economic Justice. That's on Lexington Books. Would appreciate if you go pick up a copy. I don't know if I've even got any royalties from it to date, but just want to spread the information around. But that was the first book, Black Tax. The second one, again, is Race and Taxes in 21st Century America. The first one looked historically, right? We went back to the ancient tax systems of Africa, Kem and Mali, and all that. Talked about taxes going through the beginning of the founding of the nation, the federal tariff, poll taxes, all types of ways in which tax was used to subordinate black people and to put us in the economic position we're in now with this huge racial wealth gap. So this book is looking more forward. We're going to start with how we got here as far as the late 80s and Starve the Beast tax policy, a policy implemented by neoconservatives. Now, I know Nazis and white supremacists and alt-right are getting all the attention right now. But if you ask me, the money behind these movements is still from the neoconservative camp. And I believe that they are, again, pushing a tax agenda which fits right in with not just plutocracy, but white supremacy as well. And so we're going to start talking about how this policy came about, this cutting taxes everywhere in the United States and even globally, how it relates to racism, how it relates to more confrontation with police, because police are now, or law enforcement communities are using law enforcement to fill their budgets because they're not able to tax people because of the Starve the Beast tax policy. So that's how we get to the Black Lives Matter movement, because we have Mike Brown being killed after he has had enough of being fined and cited for minor violations that really aren't for public safety in Ferguson, but they're really to tax black citizens. They're designed to transfer the incidence of taxation from wealthy and white to poor and black. And then we also will talk about other taxes like soda taxes, cigarette taxes, and other exactions that are coming out of the inner cities, but not so much the suburbs, right? And they're supposed to be for your own good, to prevent diabetes or prevent cancer, but they seem to be pretty badly designed if affecting public health is the goal. Now, again, I have some very, 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 very good public health advocates, and I understand they're wanting to start the conversation. I understand them wanting to make ways where they can to get people thinking about better health, even if it doesn't have a direct impact on diabetes or cancer, but it's coming at a huge cost. And you can't just say that any minimal or marginal improvement in public health justifies every exaction of tax and reduction of liberty. So we're going to talk about that. So what I'm saying is we're going to talk about the different ways taxation is manifesting and maintaining racism right now, not just how it did it in history. But after we talk about racial tax circumstances and how it's maintaining the wealth gap, we use this to deconstruct, but we also want to use construction, right? So, as a nationalist, we recognize that interest convergence, as Derek Bell put it, means that white people, black people work in public coalitions to solve racial problems when it's in the interest of white folks to do so. But closing the racial wealth gap, I submit, is not within the interest or the obvious interest of white folks. Now, we could come up with different ways of suggesting that it's in their long-term interest, but in the short term, a medium term doesn't seem to be in their interest. And therefore, that has to be addressed by Black people ourselves, right? And the way in which we're going to do that is through part 2 of the book. So part 1 will explain why and how we got here, including 21st century poll taxes, right? We're going to examine voter ID laws and other voter suppression tactics and try to ask, at what point the cost, right? The extra time, the extra money, the extra resources that you have to spend getting a voter ID, getting to the polls. When does that amount to a tax? Because if they charge you $10, we know that's a tax and that's illegal. But if we make it $10 harder on you, as far as you having to get a babysitter or take public transportation, shouldn't that be considered also a tax? So again, these are all the ways taxes are used, and here surreptitiously, without even using tax as the label to reinforce subordination, racism, the racial wealth gap, etc. But after that, again, we're going to talk about how we as Black folks can use taxes to shorten or reduce the racial wealth gap. We're going to question whether we as Black folks are doing as well as we could. Can we use the tax code more efficiently? Right? The tax code is all about distributing money. Right? Yes, on the one hand, we're collecting money for those who pay taxes, but we're also giving money out in the form of deductions and credits and exclusions. And are we getting the most out of that? We complain about other people, and rightly so, about tax shelters and loopholes and how they save money. They make money off of this tax code where, well, it's more than just complaining about them. We must also utilize the code to our advantage to the best we can. And so we have a couple questions. Number one, are we using the tax code efficiently when it comes to financial investments? In other words, are we getting all the subsidies we could from the government to help us invest? And one of those subsidies is our 401k, our 403b. What did the studies show about how much we are utilizing that device? Right? If it's free money being given away as far as lower taxes, then we need to take advantages as much as we can on top of getting the interest and the return on investment. Through that, we're going to talk about this distinction between similarly situated people and income, similarly situated wealth. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to taxes later. But after we talk about taxation as financial investments, we're also going to talk about taxation in real estate. The interesting thing is Dorothy Brown, one of the queens of critical race theory and critical race tax theory especially, she's written on both. And one of her more controversial and yet popular articles talks about how Black people get screwed by real estate investment and how investing in financial stocks and bonds and whatnot is probably a better, or at least historically, since the 80s, has provided a better return. Why? Because it's harder to be discriminated against. That when it comes to real estate, we understand white flight. That because white folks leave interracial neighborhoods, so that once a neighborhood becomes more than 10% Black, white folks tend to leave, that means there's less buyers for that neighborhood, which means the property values go down, which means black people that invest in black neighborhoods don't get the rate of return. Now, so the question becomes, do you invest in black neighborhoods? Do you invest in white neighborhoods? Do you keep chasing white folks to the neighborhoods that they go to? Or do you forego investing in real estate altogether and invest in financial uh, investments? And again, this all is dealing with taxation, and there's a lot more concerns about housing than taxation. But I think it's a very valid question to explore to determine whether we're efficiently on a march toward capital accumulation. I will say this, it's got to be very complicated because even if we think that investing in stock and bonds is more lucrative and less discrimination than in real estate, we also know that you have to live somewhere and that there is no deduction for rent, but there is a deduction for mortgage interest. So there's already a huge disadvantage of not investing in real estate at all. Now, maybe the question of second, third, fourth homes, flipping houses, and all that becomes the second question. But it's a very interesting dynamic. It's just a very interesting dynamic. So but we're not done there. We're also going to talk about whether black folks, and I suggest that we're not, and I know we're not on this one. Again, it's not a criticism as far as inferiority, but it's just we need to develop strategies to do more. And I don't. And when it comes to subsidies from the tax code, one of the biggest is deductions for activities engaged in for profit, a hustle, right? A side gig, right? Your attempt to be an entrepreneur. And here's the thing, legally speaking, there is a very, very slim, imperceptible difference between a hobby, which is for fun, and you're not looking to make any money, and you don't get any deductions for that. So that's just money wasted, more or less, versus an activity engaged in for profit, where it's something I'm interested in, it's something that I think is fun or I've done my whole life, but because I'm actually trying to make a profit, I get to deduct my expenses. So that means even if I didn't make a profit that year, even if I only brought in $1,000, but I spent $5,000 trying to build myself up, I can take that $4,000 deduction against my salary as a line tech or wherever else I work, right? And that's how we can transition from an employee into an entrepreneur by this middle stage, this activities engaged in for profit, where I'm building up a hustle and then hopefully converting that into a business. Our job as tax lawyers needs to be getting you all the way to that business. But the very first step, the very first way we can earn more money, the way we can add to the black GDP is to take these activities that are just hobbies and being more business minded about it, converting them to activities engaged in for profit, and being able to deduct those expenses off our tax returns. Again, if you like to go out to eat, don't just be a foodie, be a food critic. A website, write about it, blog about it, sponsor trips or whatever, all types of creative things. But if you're actually trying to make money off of it, then you're able to you enjoy the activity, but you're also doing something financially sound. And hopefully in the long term, you're plotting your escape from the master servant relationship that employment is. All right, so those are the 6 chapters that we're going to talk about when it comes to race and taxes in the 21st century America. And we're going to present each one. So each one of those, we're going to talk about them in a lot more detail as we go along in the next week to 2 weeks. And after we're done, hopefully the manuscript will be done. My dude, Professor Vince Williams, coming at you for some great, for your expertise in proofreading and editing and all that. And so we'll have that book out for purchase hopefully by the end of the year. Let me also mention again, Solutions Media Group, Ty Fellenberg, she's coming through with a brand new website for Economic Justice Law Review and for Afrolantica.com. This series will be on both. It will be on Afrolantica.com and it will be on the Economic Justice Law Review. Being able to purchase the book will be on both. And then, of course, you'll also see all the other great features and activities that we plan for those 2 websites. It's going to be great. So, ready to talk about race and taxes in 21st century America, and most specifically, recent cases of regressive and racist taxation in the United States of America. In other words, I need to let you know about what's going on with taxes in America because there's something pretty dastardly going on. And what we're going to end with, I'm going to start with what we're going to finish with. We're going to finish with the Philadelphia soda tax. I'm from Philly, and many of you know me, right? And so you're going to also be from Philadelphia as well and from other parts of town. But even if you're not, cigarette taxes in DC, there's a grocery bag tax. All across the country, people are, the cities and towns are raising taxes on what we call excise taxes, right? And that's and those are what we call regressive taxes because poor people have to pay a greater percentage of their income and they're harder to avoid. And this is designed to avoid, this is all part of the starving the beast strategy, where we're trying to relieve, or forces are trying to relieve wealthy people of their tax burden and put it on poor and black folks. So that keeps the racial wealth gap divided, keeps wealth inequality, and keeps the system of white supremacy, keeps the power at the top where they believe it belongs. But it's done subtly. It's not done in an obvious manner. No one is going to say, "Hey, let's just pass taxes on black people. Let's just pass taxes in the urban city." And as a matter of fact, they've co-opted, as I mentioned before, they've co-opted some progressive scholars and progressive thinkers by calling these sin taxes, right? That we're going to affect the public health, we're going to affect diabetes and cancer, when the real goal, the underlying goal, is to pass the tax incidence of funding government all across the country off of rich and white onto poor and black. So I need this paper to inform just the public and also my public health scholars, because I know you're not interested in supporting black people, and you don't want to be unwittingly like 21st century missionaries, right? Like that went into Africa, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, right? You had noble intentions, but you didn't know that the guns were coming behind you. Well, this is also a similar situation. I understand you want to fight cancer. I understand you want to fight diabetes, but we have to be cognizant of trends around the country and the way in which progressive ideals are being used as pretext for racial subordination, right? So let's go. We're going to talk about race in taxes. So let me first talk about what is fairness in the tax system. Now, again, a child knows fair, right? One of the things about the law is that we use long words to describe things that even a child knows. So we're going to say regressive or inequitable or blah, 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 when a child knows what's fair. No, that's not fair. But we need to be more precise. And the reason why we need to be more precise is, let me go back to this idea of Afro-Lanica, right? If we were going to create our own country, if we are going to start from scratch, if we are going to create the better system, what would our tax system be, right? The distinction between capitalism and socialism and communism is really just taxes, right? Pure capitalism, there's not going to be any taxes, so there's not going to be any social services. Socialism is going to be a higher number of higher amount of taxes because you need to fund social services. On the other hand, communism, or even just a wholly oppressive system where you're just not allowed to own private property at all, anything you earn is just confiscated by the government. That's 100% tax, right? Slavery was 100% tax, right? Complete repression and oppression. So we can think of different political systems in a rude way by just talking about the taxes, right? Capitalism has the lowest taxes, socialism the second lowest, and then communism and other forms of fascism would have very, very high taxes. But that's not enough. That's not the standard or what tells us whether we have a fair tax system. So in the United States of America, there's four prongs to a fair tax system. I'm going to criticize them later, but there's four. And if we were in Afro-Lanica, this is why we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some scholars, when they see American jurisprudence or Western jurisprudence, it's no good. We don't want to use it. Can't burn down the master's house with the master's tools. With all due respect to Audre Lorde, there's nothing that they had that we didn't give them. There's nothing in the world that belongs to them. So they have offered a construct about fairness, and I think it is useful, and yet we need to add to it. So the first thing, if we were in Afro-Lanica, the first thing about taxes is we'd like taxes to be what we call micro-efficient. In other words, it doesn't burden you to figure out how to pay them. right? It doesn't take you a whole long time. So like sales taxes and other stuff, they're simple percentages. They're a percentage of what you buy. They're taken from you at the counter. It's really not complicated at all. Versus the federal income tax, which has all types of loopholes, exclusions, calculations, phase outs, etc. And it changes from year to year. That is not very efficient microeconomically. And so that is one of the reasons or metrics that we use to determine whether the tax system is fair. And so, yes, it's okay to say that this tax system is unfair because it's too complicated for me to follow. It needs to be being complicated to follow means also complicated to administer, and that presents its own set of problems because the IRS, the taxing service, also needs to be able to interpret it in a simple way. Because the more complex it is, the more those with wealth can take advantage of it versus others that don't. So we need it to be administrable by the service and that collects taxes, and we need people that have to pay it to be able to understand it. That's micro efficiency. It also needs to be, or ought to be, or we try to make it as much as possible. We never can reach a total ideal. It's always as close to perfect as we can try to get. So macro efficiency means we want taxes to not burden or not discourage transactions. We want you to not think about taxes when it comes to buying stuff. So, like when you were a kid and you saved up $30 or $20 to buy a video game, and you saved it all up, or you got the money for Christmas, and then you went to go get the game, and then you don't have enough because of taxes. Now, hopefully, your people's backed you up, but the point is that the fact that I could not buy this game because of taxes hurts the economy, right? So we don't like that. Um, and let's say that, or even even worse, your first paycheck. Remember when you got your first paycheck and you thought you were getting paid five? I'm from the '80s, so we was getting paid $3.35 an hour. But again, so let's say you're a minimum wage employee and you get your first check. And you look down, and again, you see FICA, Social Security tax, and all that, and you get half of your check, 60% of your check, and you say this was not even worth it, right? Especially if by working you're now not eligible for, let's say, other assistance. So the taxes that were taken out, the money I can't get from public assistance programs, and now all I get is this check. So taxes and other things can make working just not worth it, right? That I'd rather play PlayStation than bust my ass for 40 or 80 hours of work for this small amount of money. So that is two examples of where we see that tax can influence whether or not you're going to be in a transaction or not. Or as a matter of fact, again, this is a little simpler. Basketball players, right? If you're in the state of Texas, if you're in the state of Florida, if you're in the state of Washington, you pay zero state tax. And so some of those players would, if it's equal between teams, especially if you're in the NBA, you're going to get a max contract. Well, it's more money if you go to a team in Florida, and that influences the marketplace. And so that is a feature of unfair taxation when we have these different rates and all the other stuff. And it's hard and it impedes on transactions, makes things people do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Okay, so those are two features of fair taxation. Then here comes the two major scholarly prongs. Number one is that tax in Afro-Atlantica or anywhere to be considered fair, people suggest that it should be horizontally equitable, right? Horizontal equity. What does that mean? That means that everyone who makes the same, people that are in the same position, should be taxed the same, right? So if I'm in the same position as you, you get taxed 20%, I should be taxed 20%, right? Well, here's the issue with that when it comes to, first of all, we don't do it. When it comes to deductions and exclusions, they are inconsistent with horizontal equity. So we just mentioned the fact that you get a deduction for mortgage interest because you own a home, but if you are a renter, you have to live somewhere too. You do not allow debt deductions. So the two people that both pay $1,000 for housing, one gets a deduction, the other does not. That is inconsistent with horizontal equity. Now, here's the interesting thing is, do we want things to be horizontal equity? Is that something that is always fair? Because let's say we have three people. One made one made $50,000 as a teacher. Another made $50,000 as a basketball player, and the third person made $50,000 at a liquor store um, selling alcohol. You might argue that they have offered different worth to society and should be rewarded differently, and therefore the teacher perhaps tax less than the basketball player, and the basketball player tax slightly less than the liquor store owner. The interesting thing about that is, again, how many distinctions would we draw? Well, the interesting thing is, in America, we draw a distinction between labor and capital. So we already decided that one person, the one that makes money off of their money, gets taxed lower than the person who works off of their labor. And just as I suggested that, does that reflect merit? In my example, we tax teachers less because they do more for society than basketball players, and basketball players do more for society than liquor store owners, and therefore the tax is gradated that way. Where here we're saying that capital owners are more important to society than labor owners. Now, we can defend that in the United States, America, because you can argue that this country is about wealth and it is consistent with the tax system they set up since the founding. But that's my whole point about Afro-Atlantic jurisprudence. Let's write on a clean slate. Would we do it the same, or would we do it slightly different? We're not going to answer that question now, but we're just talking about, again, what does it mean to have a fair tax system? And again, not just as far as criticizing the United States, but if we were going to start something new, would we respect this type of stuff? When it comes to horizontal equity, let's also bring this as a challenge. In the United States, similarly situated means that I have the same amount of income. So again, we use the professor or the teacher that made 100,000, the basketball player that made 100,000, and the liquor store owner that made $100,000. But are they really similarly situated? Because race tells us something different. That if you are in basically within, if you're only talking about white folks, maybe it will. But here's where critical race theory and critical race tax theory interjects. There is a racial wealth gap. And white families on average own, I don't know, somewhere between 7 to 13 times more than your typical black family. Why? Because of the history of racism. We've done this in our other episodes about Monopoly, right? That if one player is not allowed to go around the board of Monopoly for 10 or 20 rolls, while everybody else is allowed to go around the board, then allowed to play the game fair after that, all the property's taken. Everybody else has wealth. And so making a comeback under those conditions, that's what we're facing here in the United States of America. We are in a monopoly game where we weren't allowed to go around the board for 30 rolls while all the property is being bought up. And so now we got to make a comeback with Baltic, Mediterranean, and little blue chumpies on the side. And so are we similarly situated? So is a black person that's making $100,000 and a white person making $100,000 in the same situation? And the studies say absolutely not. That the white person with $100,000 also has more savings and has family members also with savings. So when it comes to paying for college, starting a business, car breaking down, other economic shocks, black folks need to have some type of reserve. Or at least tend to have more reserve because you have less wealth in the bank, where white folks are more able to commit more of their salary to a mortgage, right, and to pay the mortgage interest. Because even if I spend all of my check on this asset, the asset appreciates, and I am able to do without that cash. I can have a longer discount rate and put more things into the future because I have savings, my parents have savings, and other family members have savings to back me up, and they understand that what I'm doing with my money, investing it in real estate or stocks and bonds, is just that, an investment. It's not like they're just, when they give me money for a down payment, it's not wasted. So similarly situated, horizontal equity, critical race theorists have a very big bone to pick with that prong of fairness. And then last, and this is what we're going to talk about here today, is vertical equity. Vertical equity describes or it leads us to a discussion between what's called a progressive tax system and a regressive tax system. A progressive tax system is one we are supposed to have now, but we're going to pick at it. It's one where wealthier pay people not just pay a greater amount, they pay a greater percentage of their wealth. I'm sorry, greater percentage of their income as taxes. So again, if I made 10,000 and you make 100,000 and we're both taxed at 20%, then I put $2,000 in the kitty. If you are taxed at 20% at $100,000, you put $20,000 in the kitty. So you pay more than me. But here's the problem. This is why it's argued that that's not fair. And it's called the diminishing marginal utility of things. And we're going to talk about the diminishing marginal utility of money. Taking $2,000 for somebody that has 10,000 hurts a lot. They only have $8,000 to do with for the rest of the year, to eat, to live. Whereas if I had 100,000 and you took 20,000 from me, I still have $80,000. Right? It's a bit of a difference. And so it doesn't cause the same amount of harm. Taking $2,000 from somebody who only has 10 in this day and time is harsh, is oppressive. I mean, you're sending this person into poverty, and who knows the things that they're going to have to do in their life, maybe crime or whatever, to make up for this difference. Versus someone who has 100,000 and you take 20,000, it's a shame. They don't like it. I don't like it. But at the same time, I live. And again, let's even ramp it up. I have a million or even a billion. We got people that make $100 million in a year nowadays. And yes, to take 20%, to take 20 million, that's a lot of money. I made 100, you're going to take 20, but guess what? I got 80 million left. It's an annoyance. It's not a pain or hurt. So we raise the rates. There's a graduated rate to cause equal pain to taxpayers. That if I'm taking $2.50 from somebody that has five, I'm taking half of their stuff. Taking $2.5 billion from somebody that has $5 billion, that leaves them with $2.5 billion left. It's something they don't like, but it doesn't hurt them. So progressive taxation is designed to cause equal harm to the taxpayer, that we're both feeling it. Now, again, we can pick at this because number one, well, there's a couple reasons. Number one, we just mentioned that we don't do this, that when it comes to wealthier folks that have capital gains income, they are taxed at a lower rate, not just the same amount, but a lower rate than people with that earn their money off of labor. So the American system is already inconsistent with what Americans, scholars, say a fair system is. And so the question becomes, in Afro-Atlantica, do we account for that? Do we make the taxation of capital and the taxation of ordinary income or labor the same? Here's another problematic with progressive taxation. It doesn't tell you what the rates ought to be. It doesn't tell you that this level of income gets 5%, this level gets 10%, this level gets 20%. So the difference in rates is still political. All progressive rates tell you, or progressive or vertical equity tells you, is that the wealthy should pay a higher percentage, but it doesn't tell you what that percentage is. And so if we have 13, poor pay 13%, well-to-do middle class pays 14%, and the super rich pay 15%. That's progressive. I don't know if it still reaches the status of fair, of equal harm to each person that pays it. And how do you even measure that in and of itself? So those are two of the problematics we have with this concept of vertical equity, or the idea that people with higher income rates should pay a higher percentage. There's other ways we could pick at these constructs, but that is where we're going to jump off from, because here, number one, we're going to argue that the spate or the trend of increased taxes around the country, we're talking about local taxes, we're not talking about federal taxes here, we're going to talk about local taxes. And this trend of shifting the burden of local taxes from wealthy and white to rich and to poor and black is, number one, it's regressive, right? Which is a violation of vertical equity. It is also against horizontal equity, in that black folks and white folks, to the extent we do believe that they are similarly situated, that communities that are more that the incidence of tax, the likelihood that communities will raise taxes through law enforcement, through fines, citations, fees, and also through regressive excise taxes like cigarette tax and soda taxes. The biggest dominant factor is that there's a large black population. We have the studies that confirm this when it comes to policing for profit as taxation. We're going to talk about that in a second. We don't have the studies that show that definitively for tax. But I will say this, the Black Lives Matter movement has recognized, they do recognize the economic injustice that is latent and patent in local taxation and the shift of taxation from wealthy and white to poor and black. So we'll talk about that stuff in a minute. So that is where so that is the chapter, or at least that'll be probably the second or third chapter in the book. Let's talk about it a little more specifically. Any discussion of race and taxes in the 21st century America, and especially the shifting of taxes from wealthy and white to poor and black, has to start with policing for profit, using law enforcement to shift the burden from wealthy and white to poor and black. And it starts. Our discussion starts with Mike Brown, right? The brother that was in the youth that was in Ferguson, Missouri, who gets stopped by a cop while walking down the street. And we'll talk about this manner of walking and the authority the cops have to stop you and fine you for just the way you're walking. It's crazy. And we see that, and we learn that this wasn't just one kid responding to not being stopped, that this was a community under siege, and that this person represented that community and just having enough. That I'm not going to hide in my house for fear of being arrested because of all these fines and fees and citations that the police keep giving me and the court system keeps locking me up for and making me pay 10 and 12 times what I originally owed in the first place. Again, this none of it had to do. Here's where, to circle back, none of it had to do with public safety. None of it. So as much of it is a constitutional injustice, as much as it is a deprivation of liberty, this is also a transfer of wealth from black to white. This is taxes. It has nothing to do with public safety. It has everything to do with closing budget deficits. And therefore, it is taxation, even if it is not called so. So let's talk about the Department of Justice report in Ferguson, Missouri, because it gives you chilling detail on how bad things were in Ferguson, Missouri. But our thing that we need to note is that the department that this is widespread, that police are using these tactics all around the country, and we know that this Department of Justice report was done under the Obama presidency, and under the Trump administration, we know we're not going to get a report. We're not going to get oversight, and communities all across the country probably feel like they have license to do this, do these type of things. And so what is this that we're talking about? So let's describe how they convert a town of Ferguson, Missouri, which used to be a majority white town, right? Used to be a suburb of St. Louis. And like many have neighborhoods like that have where black people move in to escape the inner city. White folks then leave those suburban places to go elsewhere, and then now are coming back in the city to gentrify it. So once it was a major white sundown town, right? A sundown town was one of those places where if you were black, you automatically get stopped if you're caught out there after sundown. And it seems to be, I guess it probably much hasn't changed, because even though 2/3 of the population in Ferguson is black, at the time of this study, 4 out of the 54 police officers were black. Only 4 out of 54. And in that time frame of the DOJ study from 2010 to 2014, they passed out 90,000 citations, and they gave out 50% more in 2014 than they did in 2010, right? They kept ratcheting up more and more and more, just squeezing the people and squeezing them more and more, even though they know the bad things that are happening. Now dig this. Here's some of the charges, right? 300 they charged in a fine, and here's again, we'll talk about this later. You get a citation or a fine, but it doesn't tell you how much it is. It's not like it's a standard $25 or $50. You have to go to court, and then a judge tells you how much the fine or the citation is going to be. And we're going to talk about how ridiculous that is when you miss a court date, or you don't even think that something like this carries a court date. So the DOJ said that the Ferguson Municipal Court fined at least one person $302 for manner of walking. Manner of walking. Right. First of all, that shouldn't even be a charge, right? That's unconstitutionally vague, gotta be. And then secondly, to charge somebody $300, not 25, not $10, $50, $302. 400. Someone was hit with a $427 fine for a peace disturbance. Somebody was hit with a $531 fine for high grass and weeds because your lawn was overgrown. So obviously, I don't have a lawnmower, and so $500, I probably could get two lawnmowers, right? But no, you're going to charge me $500 for overgrown vegetation. We know that the overgrown vegetation was not the issue. $777 for resisting arrest, $792 for failing to obey, and somebody got hit with $527 for failure to comply. And they all mean the same thing, talking back to the police. And the DOJ was very consistent with this, that these fines were given out wantonly for those that exercise their First Amendment right to complain about their Fourth Amendment violation of being illegally stopped by police. So we're talking hundreds of dollars, not 20s of dollars, hundreds of dollars that folks are getting fined. Again, this is a blueprint for taxation. It's crazy. I'm sorry. So on top of levying the fines, they also issue arrest warrants, right? If you can't pay the fine, you get arrested. Right. And so there is a Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Wren, that says you can't lock people up just for being poor, and you can't lock them up for not paying a fine. But the way around it is they say, oh, well, you are in contempt of court and we can arrest you for that. Now, what sense does that make? Contempt of court means you've told me something as a court. You have the authority to make me do something, and I willfully decide that I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to thumb my nose up at your authority. So that assumes that you have the money to pay the fine, and you just decide I'm not going to pay it because F the court. That's not what's going on here. We have people that can't pay and therefore are getting interest on top of that. Don't forget the interest, that we're going to get interest on top of this debt, an arrest warrant that's also going to carry a fee. And we're going to charge you to serve it. We're going to, if a cop has to serve you the warrant, they're going to charge you like 25 cents a mile that the cop had to go. We're talking about fees upon top of fees, on top of fees, on top of fees. How about the fee for your jail stay? For your room, right? When you're arrested because you can't pay the fine, you get arrested, put in jail, and they're going to charge you for that room. Wow. And they're going to suspend your license if you don't pay the fine immediately. So how am I supposed to work? How am I supposed to keep a job? How am I even supposed to make it to court when I'm driving around when you suspend my license? And of course, if I get caught with a suspended license, shoot, if they're going to give me $500 for overgrown vegetation, what's the fine for license suspension? And no, Ferguson does not have good public transportation, right? As if that was under doubt. So you get the municipal court charges you a $50 fee on top of the payment of your fines to clear the warrant, right? Another fee is assessed each time you fail to appear. And then again, if you've got multiple absences, multiple cases, and the assessed amount is almost completely discretionary. And of course, if you're black, it's going to be more likely that you get the fee, and it's going to be a higher fee. They don't have any regard for financial capacity. There is no community service option. There is no weighing of your ability to pay. So here we go. So DOJ spoke to one woman, an African-American woman who has a still pending case from 2007, right? 2007, 10 years ago. On a single occasion, she parks her car illegally. She receives 2 citations and a $150 fine plus the fees. The woman doesn't have a lot of money. She's in and out of homelessness. So over several years, she's hit with 7 failure to appear offenses for missed court dates or fine payments on her parking tickets. Can't pay them anyway, and the court also doesn't accept partial payments and whatnot. And if she does go with a partial payment, not payment, she risks that they just lock her up. So she doesn't even appear. So from 2007 to 2010, she's racking up fees, interest, and the like. Um, they From 2007 to 14, she's arrested twice. She spent 6 days in jail. Again, that's going to add to your fee. She pays $550 to the court for the events stemming from the single illegal parking. She also tried to make $25 and $50 payments, but the court returned those payments to her, saying that they won't accept anything less than payment in full. One of those payments was later accepted. She's now making regular payments on her fine. It's 2014. Remember, this started in 2007. 7 years later, $150 fine. She paid $550 on it. She still owes $541. So if she would have cut her a check right then and there in 2014 to clear her bill, that would have been basically $1,100 to pay Ferguson for a $150 fine. That is absurd. It is taxation. It has nothing to do with public safety. It has everything to do with funding government on the backs of poor black people. It's even worse. It gets worse. The municipal court tends to find ways to prolong cases and exact more money from those least able to pay. Interest, um, bond forfeitures, right? Even when you have satisfied everything that you're supposed to do after an arrest, they find ways to keep your bond, or they mail it to you and hopefully you're not there anymore and it comes back to them undeliverable, or they don't even have arcane procedures or whatnot to the people point where they just wear you down. And this doesn't even tap into what we'll discuss later is civil asset forfeiture. That when I stop you and I think that money in your car relates to a crime or something, I can just take it and just take your property. And cops across the country have collected billions on this, and of course, disproportionately from African Americans and poor black people. So is a court system that has been totally reconfigured towards revenue generation. It is a taxing authority in Missouri, and is reminiscent of the Jim Crow courts in the South that Douglas Blackman describes in Slavery by Another Name, where it's totally redesigned to subjugate black folks and put them in the convict leasing system. Here, they can't put you in the convict leasing system, but at least it's in the convict system, and they figure they can get as much money out of you as possible. The court officials even admitted to the DOJ that the number of offenses requiring an appearance relates to revenue production and has nothing to do with public safety. This is taxation. It is not law enforcement. So that's regressive. The fact that poor people can't avoid this, it takes a much greater, higher percentage of their income, right? A $50 fine, a $100 fine takes more of a percentage of a poor person's income than it does a wealthy person's. But is it racist? Yes, indeed. So here's what the DOJ had to say about discriminatory intent. So even though Ferguson's population is two-thirds black, black residents accounted for 90% of the citations, 93% of the arrests. So let's flip this around. So other people or whites compass 33, were one-third of the population, yet got arrested 7% of the time. 93% of the arrests were against black folks. Almost every citation for manner of walking or failure to comply was issued to an African American, right? Manner of walking, right? Walking with a strut, right? And failure to comply, back talking, or what? Reckless eyeballing. African Americans account for 95% of manner of walking charges, 94% of failure to comply, 92% of resisting arrest, 92% of all peace disturbances, 89% of all failure to obey. And African Americans are 68% less likely than others to have their cases dismissed. And in 2013, just 92% of all cases went against African Americans, right? 92% of cases in which an arrest warrant was issued, black folks. Black drivers are likely stopped at a disproportionate rate, despite contraband being found in 30% of searches involving whites, but only 24% involving blacks. So when cops search a car, do they find drugs? Do they find guns? Well, 3 out of 10 if it's a white car, 24%, 1 out of 4 if it's a black car. But yet, the DOJ shows that African Americans were treated worse in almost every particular way. They even mentioned a bar brawl where like 40, 50 white dudes get there, nobody gets arrested. But when it comes to black folks, you know, in all 14 cases of where someone was charged for resisting arrest, of course, happened with a black person. White folks apparently in Ferguson just don't resist arrest ever. How about multiple citations? You're going to get more than one, right? Half of all Americans who received a citation got more than one in that single encounter. The same only happened to 1/4 of non-African Americans. At the Ferguson gave out 4 or more to a single person 73 times, and every time it was a black person. Only 4 times did they give more than 4 citations to a non-African American. No white person was ever issued more than 5 citations in one encounter. The record, 14 against a black person. 14 tickets, 14 citations on one encounter. The municipal court, 50% more likely to issue an arrest warrant for a black resident. 96% of those actually arrested by the FPD, outstanding warrants were black. 27 of the 28 people arrested for outstanding warrants held for more than 2 days were black. Regardless of the offense, the court gives African Americans higher average fines. Again, this is just rampant racist taxation. So that should give you a sense of how bad it is or bad it was in Ferguson, Missouri. And the interesting thing about this is they argued about whether the Department of Justice and Ferguson officials argued about whether it was more, whether they were collecting 18% of the city's money through law enforcement or 12%. Well, there's another town in St. Louis that got 38% of its budget from fines, fees, tickets, interest, bond, forfeitures, etc. Again, this is not just a Ferguson problem. It's not just a Missouri problem. It is rampant all over the country. And is it a tax? Well, yeah, it is a tax. So let's talk, again, legally speaking, about the definition of what a tax is. First of all, there is none. Again, you know I've railed against textualism and the plain meaning rule. Well, then what does tax mean? Well, we don't know. Not only does a textualist not know what direct means in tax, doesn't know what tax means. And we know this from a recent case, NHIB versus Sebelis, or the Obamacare case. In that case, the Supreme Court held that the patient responsibility payment, right, the penalty that you get if you don't have health care, that can be labeled as a tax. And here's the funny part about the Supreme Court. They didn't say it is a tax. They didn't say this is a tax. This is the definition of a tax. This thing fits the definition, right? That's formalism. They said, no, it kind of functions like a tax, looks like a tax. It's put in the tax code, so I guess it's a tax, or at least it could be a tax. They said it could be a tax, and they will defer to Congress on the matter. They did not give a definition of tax. Second, give you a second example. Again, we talked about these poll taxes, right? Whether or not charging people to vote is going to be a poll tax. And yes, in Georgia, I believe, they tried to restrict voting to those that had a voter ID, and then you had to pay $5 or $10 for the voter ID. And that was quickly found to be unconstitutional as an illegal poll tax. So even though it wasn't called a tax in the healthcare thing, it's a patient responsibility payment, even though it's a voter ID that you had to pay for, they were still called taxes. So we don't have to label it a tax for it to be so. And so the question here is, what other purpose does it serve? If it serves some other legitimate purpose, then maybe it is just a fee. It's a fine. To the extent it had no law, when they have no law enforcement goal, then we can call this a tax, right? And that's what we saw with the Department of Justice here. And is it a trend? Yes, let's believe it is a trend. Municipalities throughout St. Louis, we talked about. The first study came through Dan Cox of Priceonomics, right, an online website. And he found that race was the dominant factor in determining whether a municipality resorted to raising revenue through law enforcement, right? He put that out about a year ago. And since then, there's been another study by two great researchers, Michael Sanses. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right if you haven't seen this. Michael Sanses and He Yong Yu, right? They combined to write a paper that confirms COPS' results and provides more detail. They find that the use of fines as revenue is both commonplace and robustly connected to the proportion of residents who are Black. Regardless, big city or small, they said whether it's a town with 100,000 or more or 100,000 or less. Cities with the largest share of Black residents collect between $12 and $19 per person than cities with the smallest Black share of residents. They also find, they even go further than Dan Cox with Priceonomics, not just with the detail, but with all the implications. Since you find that the presence of a Black member of city council influences, but does not prevent, but it influences the levying of such informal taxes. The relationship between race and fines is 50% less in cities with at least one Black representative. Right, and this circles all the way back to what we just talked about with poll taxes. If we're allowed to then put poll taxes on you and restrict your voting rights, it's going to be harder to get that Black person on the city council. Without that city council, we don't care about you, and therefore raising taxes by putting them on you as law enforcement, as a white person has no animus against Black people. Oh, it just escapes my attention. I didn't even know it was that bad. Who knew, right? So fines and fees, clearly a national trend. Also, we haven't talked yet about civil asset forfeiture, right? That is also a national trend. Here we have billions of dollars, and I mean literally billions of dollars, taken by law enforcement agencies all across the country to when they just suspect that it's part of a crime. And they have all types of devices to give it back, to not give it back to you, even, and they keep it. They can keep it even if you're not convicted of the crime. And what do? They say, well, we'll not charge you. Or if they find it in your house, oh, we won't file charges in family court to take your kids away if you consent to us keeping the money that we took from you or that we found. Really, really disgusting stuff. And you saw that Obama and Eric Holder stopped the practice, or at least minimized that practice. And as soon as you had Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump come in the building, civil asset forfeitures is back on. And what do they use to hire more cops, to buy that body armor and the military style tanks? It's also reminiscent again of a story told in slavery by another name. That when in the antebellum South, or even in Jim Crow South, if you were walking along and they tell a story about a guy who just comes along with any white person, random white person, and white person says, "Hey, nigga, you got any money?" And from that statement, you know you are caught in the trap. On the one hand, for you to say yes, that person is going to demand it. Secondly, if you say, and if you don't give it to them, they're going to say that you owed it to them or that you got into some type of fight or whatever, and they're going to turn you into the criminal justice system. And they're going to get a bounty for all this. Or you're going to say, no, I don't have any money, and they're going to have you arrested for vagrancy or loitering or loud talking, or as we saw in Ferguson, manner of walking. This is how, again, there's talk about how the slave patrols and all that morphed into the police officers and was used as a tool of subordination to tax you 100% if we could put you in the convict leasing system. And again, to tax you perhaps as much if we just put you in the system of fees, fines, civil asset forfeitures, bond forfeitures, etc. Which brings us to, again, court and incarceration fees. Another thing that's not talked about is, again, holding people in jail when you don't have to. Simply to charge them rent as if it's a hotel, an involuntary hotel. And what makes this particularly disgusting is juvenile detention. That even juveniles are being charged for their rooms. The charges are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So the moment you hit 18, even if your record is clean, you have a laundry list of charges and debts. The average debt for an incarcerated individual becomes about $13,000. And even if an employer is not allowed to ask you, have you been incarcerated? They can look on your credit report and see that debt, and they can figure it out, right? It can affect your housing, all types of stuff. And so, and just that, Andrea Freeman talked about the credit that's needed for people in debt, and those are in discriminatory terms. So the racial wealth gap for this teenager that has a $13,000 debt the moment he hit 18, the racial wealth gap is very personal for that individual. And to suggest that this person should adopt respectability politics and engage with the system as the rest of us had and should succeed and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Again, this is we see how difficult that is, how unreasonable it is, and taxation in all of its forms, in its informal sense, through fees, fines, court fees, and all that tells us how bad it is. Right, Alexandra Bastian, she wrote a great piece on this, on the taxing nature of it, and she lists a ton of different solutions that can be offered, to have ability to pay hearings, to set guidelines, but she also mentions that the disparities where black children are held for longer periods and therefore charged more than white kids, and the debts that we have on these negative reports lead to imprisonment, unemployment, and recidivism. They're also counterproductive, right? To the extent you put these people in jail and they can't pay at all, and they get locked up for another crime and have to get locked up again. You're not getting any return for investment. So there is a point where even the scheme itself eats at itself and defeats itself by locking up too many people who can't pay at all, and it causes more to actually house them than they actually have in payment. So that is policing for profit. It is clearly regressive, it is clearly racist, and it is clearly national. It is a national trend. And so we're going to add to that in this last part whether or not the imposition of sin taxes fits this mold as well. So instead of informal taxes, let's talk about formally levied taxes like the Philadelphia soda tax and ask whether it's racist. Now, again, we're not criticizing, I am not suggesting Michael Nutter or any of the city councilmen, because Michael Nutter tried to sponsor it before Mayor Kenny, or any other legislature. They are not an Uncle Tom or a racist. We're talking about post-intentional racism. Their job is to figure out how to fund Philadelphia, how to get public school running and whatnot. And if the best way or the easiest way is through a tax of soda, they have to consider it. However, as a scholar, it's my job to see the trends all around the country that they don't see, and to see that this is part of a trend of shifting the incidence of taxation from wealthy and white onto poor and black. It was interesting, even though she didn't cite any studies, or me or anybody else, that Councilwoman Blondell Reynolds Brown said, again, tax Perrier on top of Pepsi, right? That she understood the regressive nature and also racist nature of the tax to levy it on those who can't avoid it and relieving those who can. Because again, let's talk about this. A soda tax is designed to reduce diabetes, but unless it's regional in scope, how can it, right? People don't live in the same places anymore. People are a lot more transient than they used to be. So having a soda tax in Philadelphia only taxes those people in Philadelphia who can't make it to the borders, right? There's people, if you are wealthy, if you have means, you can shop outside the city and buy all the soda you'd like. I live in Winfield, part of Philadelphia, right on City Line Avenue. So I can cross the street to Bala Cynwyd and buy soda without the tax and then hop over. Matter of fact, there's a joke about how you got to go to the suburbs and now hustle sodas across city lines to avoid the tax. And it may sound funny, but think about the fact that Eric Garner was killed by New York police because they thought he was selling untaxed cigarettes, loosies, right? Again, taxation, the more there is taxation, the more there is avoidance, the more there is confrontation with law enforcement, and we don't particularly end up with, we end up with the short end of the stick most times when that happens. So this tax on soda, which is, there is no tax on sugary food. So again, if you're wealthy and white and you can get out of the city, first of all, the city is predominantly black. The white folks that live in the city are disproportionately wealthier than the black people in it. There are some, of course, there are some white folks that are in the same boat as black, but proportionally, wealthy white folks can avoid this tax. Not only they can avoid this tax, they can also do things that kill them, like skydiving and other dangerous activities without taxes. But we're told that poor people have to pay taxes on soda to keep them from getting diabetes or cancer. Now, here's the thing. Again, um, public health advocates love you to death. Yes, black people, I would love us to be a lot more healthier and avoid sugar and and whatnot. But let's keep it real. Let's keep it really real. Number one, if you live in the inner city, your life expectancy is shorter than other folks. And so to the long-term benefits of avoiding sugar is lost on you if you're and let's be frank here, if your life expectancy is, if you see your friends dying at 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, then your concern about diabetes and cancer is much less than others. So your other people's utility function is being heaped upon others who aren't actually similarly situated. So that's one of the flaws. A second flaw is this. Um, Sometimes we know what we do is wrong, and we do it anyway. Why? Because it's a luxury. If you are broken in the city, sugar and cigarettes, a soda, a tasty cake, right? I'm from Philadelphia. I'm all down with tasty cake, crimpets, and whatnot. That's sometimes the only luxury you can afford. No, I cannot afford skydiving. No, I cannot afford to go to the Eagles game or the Phillies game and pay $30 for a hot dog or something like that. That when I get off work, a pack of Skittles or whatever may be the luxury that I enjoy. And so when we're talking about taxes on regressive taxes on black folks in the inner city, we're talking about taking away property, right? Taking more money and taking away more liberty, more less things to do, less things that I'm able to do for what? Marginal gains in public health. And yes, I understand that we need to get people thinking about it. We need to get people to understand more so about health and this and the third. But there's another side to that. We cannot, it's not justified at all costs. And if we see the trend where wealthy white neighborhoods, even poor white neighborhoods outside the city are not being taxed. They're not being taxed on sugar, and they're not being taxed on cigarettes. And so if we see a disproportionate application of this, then we need to take note and pull back on our advocacy for a policy that may sound good in as far as progressive ideals, but its application is highly, highly problematic. Now, this isn't just about a soda tax. Again, there's grocery taxes, bag taxes. More states and communities are talking about taxing services. So barbershops, right? Hair salons, that instead of raising property tax or income taxes on the wealthy people that live in that city, that want to tax people that provide services. Again, people taxing labor even more harshly than we have before. So this is a national trend, and I think we don't have the numbers that Sansons and you crunch for policing for profit, but the Black Lives Matter movement has taken notice. It's part of their policy platform to fight against these regressive and racist taxes. And this hopefully will provide some interest convergence between poor blacks and poor whites, because poor whites in Kensington or other parts of the city are subject to the same restrictions. And if there's only a marginal increase in public health, while there's a huge transfer or a substantial transfer of tax incidence from wealthy and white to poor and black, then that is when we can call this soda tax, and perhaps even the trend around the country, perhaps we can call this racist, right? Racist and regressive taxation. So here again, hopefully this is a way we can show how taxation can be used as a tool to widen the racial wealth gap. Now, whether this is intentional or structural, first of all, does that matter? Right? We're still in the position. So first of all, this is information that we need to lobby or use as far as lobbying our politicians, as far as responding op-eds on the internet or what have you, that just because it's a tax on Philadelphia doesn't mean it's only about Philadelphia. It's a national thing. It relates to group subordination. Again, when we talk about policing for profit, we're not just talking about Ferguson, Missouri. We're talking about places all around the country. We could even probably extend this to tolls on roads and other things like that. But we're going to leave this to the side, and we're going to stop here because I think you've gotten the gist of this on one chapter of our book on race and taxes in 21st century America. This is the chapter on regressive and racist formal and informal taxation, and we hope you enjoy it. We will be back in the next episode to talk more specifically about starve the beast policy and how it got us here and towards the Black Lives Matter movement. Instead of tax, we're going to talk about a little bit about philosophy, and we're going to talk about the difference between neoconservatism, liberalism, progressivism, and how that relates to taxes and how we come up with the system we have now, and why Mike Brown and Eric Garner's death is, again, at the hands of taxes. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you later, hopefully very shortly. Bye.